Have you ever imagined that a single glimpse of someone in their most private moment could seal both your destinies and even spark a life or death ultimatum? In this thrilling sci-fi adventure, that's exactly what happens when a Terran ambassador stumbles upon a sacred Aurelian spring and accidentally witnesses an alien princess in a vulnerable state. From forced marriage to ancient prophecies, each twist raises the stakes higher, culminating in shocking confrontations and desperate alliances. If you want to uncover every dramatic moment, from the tense standoff at the sacred waters to the final showdown in the hidden catacombs, be sure to listen through to the very end. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us create and share more captivating stories, spanning galaxies and beyond. You won't want to miss what happens next. Commander Ethan Rivers was not a man who shied away from discomfort. As the newly appointed Terran ambassador to the alien world of Aurelia Prime, he had seen more than his share of hazardous environments. Still, even years of military training and diplomatic missions could hardly prepare him for hiking across a terrain unlike anything he had ever encountered. The climate on Aurelia Prime was dominated by twin suns that blazed overhead, their combined heat bearing down in waves so intense that Ethan felt as if he were wearing a mobile furnace instead of his standard-issue black diplomatic armor. The ground beneath his heavy boots was a mixture of sparkling mineral deposits and coarse, jagged stones, making each step a calculated risk. Yet, despite the intense conditions, Ethan continued onward, determined to experience this unique world firsthand and honor his mission to strengthen relations between the Terran Confederacy and the Aurelians. The terrain around him was mesmerizing, a labyrinth of pearlescent cliffs that glittered under the dual suns. Wisps of steam rose from various cracks in the ground, and every now and then he would glimpse small pools of water shimmering under the heat. He recalled the briefing he had studied en route from Terra. The Aurelian people held certain hot springs as sacred, integrally linked with their ancient beliefs and rites of passage. A cautious man by nature, Ethan was keenly aware that misunderstanding a custom on Aurelia Prime could provoke an incident that might reach interplanetary proportions. This was not simply a question of politeness. It was a matter of life and death for diplomatic ties between two civilizations. Accompanying him earlier had been an Aurelian guide named Sarek, a slender figure with a bluish hue to his skin and a crest of fine, shimmering hair. Sarek, unfortunately, had excused himself back at a lookout point, having received a summons from the capital city. He'd left Ethan with stern instructions to follow the marked path and avoid straying into areas designated off-limits. Yet here Ethan was, feeling the dryness in his throat and sensing a trickle of sweat along his brow. By his calculations, the designated diplomatic compound was not far ahead, just over the next ridge, if the digital map on his forearm display was to be trusted. Overcoming the next incline brought a sense of relief, for it meant he was nearing the end of his trek. As he rounded a bend in the narrow trail, the sight of a recessed, mist-enshrouded valley met his gaze. In its center, the largest of the hot springs he had seen yet bubbled and hissed, sending forth thick clouds of steam that curled into the air with hypnotic grace. Ethan recognized this pool as likely sacred. He remembered Sarek's veiled comments about revered sites hidden among the crystalline crags. A sudden splash echoed across the gorge, momentarily startling him. Someone was definitely in the water, though he could not see more than a silhouette beyond the haze. Attempting discretion, Ethan edged closer, keen to identify who might be occupying this remote spot. His earpiece crackled with static, and he realized too late that communication with the outside world might be weak in such an isolated location. He shrugged off his unease. Something about the sound, the gentle splash, the quietly content hum, made him curious. That was when the steam parted just enough for him to glimpse a figure through the milky wisps, pale skin that glowed against the swirling mist, elongated limbs moving with fluid grace, and long, ink-black hair that framed an otherworldly face. It took him a heartbeat to register that this was an Aurelian female, completely unclothed, immersed in water she presumably believed private. Ethan's first instinct was to step back and retreat. Diplomatic training had taught him that societies throughout the galaxy held countless protocols surrounding personal privacy, and Aurelians were reputed to be particularly stringent when it came to sacred spaces. Yet in the midst of his attempt to move away, The woman's dark eyes snapped open. Through the dissipating steam, he realized that he had already been spotted, and not just spotted, but locked in a gaze that felt startlingly intimate. A surge of adrenaline shot through him, compelling him to raise a hand in what he hoped was a reassuring gesture. "I'm sorry," he managed, his voice catching in his throat. "I didn't mean to intrude." For several heartbeats, the woman did not move or speak. Her expression was one of astonished alarm, yet it was underpinned by something else Ethan couldn't fully interpret. Pride, maybe, or raw indignation. In a fluid motion, she rose from the water, her body bare against the pale aura of the rising steam, and snatched a pearly towel from a ledge. She wrapped it around herself with practiced efficiency, though not before Ethan had inadvertently witnessed more than any respectful ambassador should. "You have seen me without covering," she said at last, her melodic voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "Our ancient laws demand a high price for this transgression." Ethan's mind raced. He scrambled to recall the cultural briefings he'd been given on Aurelia Prime. Were there guidelines regarding accidental sightings of unclothed nobility, or something akin to it? He vaguely remembered some mention of ritual cleanliness and taboo. Heart pounding in his chest, he took a step forward, but kept his gaze respectfully averted. The last thing he wanted was to compound his mistake. "This was not intentional," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I was merely following the path toward the diplomatic compound. If I have dishonored you or broken your traditions, please." She cut him off with an authoritative gesture. "My name is Prince Nalia Turson, daughter of High Counselor Turson. This is one of our most sacred springs, only to be used under specific rites. You, a Terran, have violated that sanctity. The consequence is severe. Once a person sees another in this most vulnerable state, either they accept a binding union or both are put to death for desecration of purity." The gravity of her statement sank in, making Ethan suddenly feel as though the hot air had grown heavier. Execution? For seeing someone bathing? He opened his mouth to protest the absurdity of it, but recalled how carefully he was supposed to tread. "Princess," he began, voice trembling with suppressed alarm. "Surely there must be a clause or provision for extenuating circumstances. I am an envoy of Earth, not a lecherous intruder." Nalia's eyes were fierce as she clutched the towel closer. Despite her tension, Ethan noticed her cheeks flushing a deeper shade. "Our laws are old and absolute. In the time of my ancestors, to witness someone at a sacred spring, unclothed and unguarded, was to lay bare their spirit. If the observer rejects that bond, it is tantamount to declaring the person worthless in the eyes of the cosmos. The penalty is certain death, to protect the sanctity of all Aurelians." Her words struck Ethan like a hammer blow. He wanted to argue, but behind the princess, further down the rocky ledge, he noticed flickers of movement, figures dressed in ceremonial black and gold, carrying polearm-like weapons that glowed faintly at the tips. They were the temple guards, presumably tasked with enforcing the very traditions Nalia was describing. The clank of their footsteps grew louder, reverberating off the crystalline rock walls. "We have no time," Nalia whispered, suddenly darting forward and grabbing Ethan by the wrist. "There's a small cave opening behind this spring. Hide there. Let me see if I can delay them." Before Ethan could muster a reply, Nalia tugged him toward an inconspicuous crack in the cliff face. He only had a moment to note the color of her dark hair swirling around her shoulders, the persistent glow of her eyes, and the regal angle of her jaw before she pushed him into the recess. Inside, the cave was surprisingly warm, the air thick with mineral-laden steam. He pressed himself against the damp rock, trying to make sense of what was happening. In less than a minute, he had gone from a routine, if sweltering, hike to being threatened with forced marriage or execution. Outside, the temple guards arrived with brisk efficiency. Their voices echoed eerily through the stone corridor. Ethan attempted to hold his breath, though his exhalations came ragged and uneven. He heard the guards speak in hushed Aurelian, too fast for him to catch every word, though he understood enough to realize they were suspicious of any foreign presence. Then came Nalia's voice, clear and measured, pitched in what sounded like carefully feigned indignation. "How dare you intrude upon my ritual cleansing without just cause?" A deeper male voice responded, presumably the leader. Princess Nalia, we received word that a Terran operative was wandering in these restricted areas. Did you see anyone else nearby? Certainly not, Naya replied, projecting the confidence of royalty. You know well that no outsider would dare enter these sacred pools, especially at the hour of purification. There was a pause. Ethan's heart pounded so loudly that he was convinced everyone could hear it. Silence, except for the soft lapping of water against rocks. Then a second guard, his voice edged with suspicion, said, We must be thorough, Princess. If the Terran ventured this way, he may already be hiding. Ethan sensed movement. They were scanning the perimeter, possibly checking behind the ledge where Nalia had been bathing, or even the shadows near the water's edge. A wave of guilt washed over him. If she were caught abetting his intrusion, she would likely suffer severe consequences too. The realization that she was risking her own life to protect him weighed heavily on him. Nalia, however, was not done. Your thoroughness is appreciated, she said, but I am alone here, as the law permits for private devotion. Unless you doubt my word? The challenge in her tone was sharp. A princess's honor, Ethan recalled from his briefings, was no minor matter in Aurelian society. The commanding guard cleared his throat, apparently cowed. Of course not, Princess. We would never doubt your honesty or your right to solitude. Please accept our apologies for the disturbance. There was some muffled conversation before heavy footsteps retreated. The tension in Ethan's body ebbed slightly. He let out a silent breath, the cave's humid air doing little to quell the tightness in his chest. After a few agonizing moments, Nalia's silhouette appeared in the cave entrance, her expression unreadable. She was still clutching that pearlescent towel, droplets of water clinging to her shoulders. They're gone for now, she said, voice low, but they'll be back soon. We need to move quickly. Stepping out of the cave, Ethan noticed that the sunlit gorge seemed even more striking after his tense, hidden weight. The steaming pools looked otherworldly, their surfaces rippling with rainbow-like patterns cast by the dual suns. Yet he had no time to admire the beauty. At Nalia's behest, he followed her up a barely perceptible pathway snaking along the cliffs. It was narrower and more precarious than the main route, but it offered cover from the vantage points where temple guards might be stationed. His pulse still hammered with anxious adrenaline. Thank you, he said, glancing at Nalia. I'm not sure what else to say. You saved my life. A flicker of something, maybe curiosity or bemusement, crossed her face. I suspect you might regret thanking me. If you hadn't seen me at the springs, you could have simply gone about your diplomatic duties. Now you're bound by one of our oldest and most sacred laws. Ethan scrambled to keep his footing on the loose stones. This law, the one that says either we marry or face execution, is there absolutely no other interpretation? Nalia paused mid-step and turned to face him, the slope behind her dropping away into a dizzying view of crisscrossing ravines. Even disheveled and only half-dressed in her towel, she exuded regal authority. In Aurelian history, there has never been a third option. The reason is tied to the concept of spiritual exposure. The springs are believed to show a person's essential self, no pretense, no concealing illusions. When someone witnesses that, they hold a piece of your soul. Denying that bond would be akin to declaring a fundamental rejection of our spiritual heritage. If that happens, the punishment is death for both parties. Her words carried a certain poetic finality, but Ethan had spent enough time navigating intergalactic treaties to know that traditions, no matter how ancient, could sometimes be negotiated or reinterpreted. Still, he had only just arrived on Aurelia Prime and lacked the knowledge or leverage to challenge something so deeply ingrained. They resumed walking, each step taking them closer to the capital city of Aurora's dawn, which loomed in the distance. The cliff trail finally spilled out onto a plateau dotted with tall, crystal spires that glistened in the sunlight. Ethan could see broad, transparent walkways bridging these spires like giant webs. At the far end of the city, overshadowed by the grandest spire of all, stood a structure of imposing grandeur, likely the palace of High Counselor Turson, where Nalia's father presided over matters of state. She gestured to a smaller door set into a side wall of the palace, partially concealed by swirling banners. That entrance leads to the lower levels, Nalia explained. It's one of the less traveled routes, used mostly by staff. If we're lucky, we can avoid detection until I find a way to explain us. Ethan swallowed, the reality of the situation crashing in anew. Us is a strong term. I barely know you, and you barely know me, yet by our law you have already seen everything that matters. She gave him a wry look, though her tone was sober. Try not to speak of it with such bitterness. The marriage arrangement might be forced by tradition, but there's room for us to define how it unfolds. He opened his mouth to answer, but found no immediate words to capture his tumultuous thoughts. Instead, he silently followed her toward the discreet entrance, mentally preparing himself for the gauntlet of Aurelian formalities that lay ahead. The winding corridors within the palace's subterranean level felt like a labyrinth of polished stone and colored glass. Luminescent crystals embedded in the walls provided a soft glow, painting shifting patterns across Ethan's black armor and Nalia's towel-clad form. She led him through twisting passageways, past storerooms and small courtyards where palace staff bustled. Some workers cast curious glances, but no one openly confronted them. Perhaps, Ethan guessed, because few would dare to question the daughter of the High Counselor. Eventually, they emerged into a chamber lined with delicate tapestries depicting scenes of heroic Aurelians alongside swirling cosmic landscapes. At the center stood a raised dais made of the translucent quartz, partially hidden by softly blowing curtains. Light from a concealed source refracted through the quartz, giving the entire platform a gentle, iridescent sheen. Nalia stepped onto the dais, beckoning Ethan to join her. "We'll be safer here," she said, gesturing for him to set aside his rifle. "This is my personal suite. Father believes in honoring my independence, so palace guards rarely intrude unless summoned. Still, it's not fully private. Some staff might enter to bring fresh linens or to tidy up. We have to be vigilant." Ethan placed his plasma rifle on a cushioned bench near a decorative column. He couldn't help but let out a small, incredulous laugh. "Vigilant about palace staff walking in on us? I'm not sure that's the scenario I envisioned when I signed up for a diplomatic post." Nalia offered a wan smile. She seemed suddenly exhausted, as though the tension was only now sinking in. Sitting gracefully on the edge of the dais, she looked more like a weary traveler than a regal princess. "Ethan Rivers," she began quietly, testing his name for the first time. "I didn't plan for any of this either. This is not how an Aurelian wedding is supposed to take shape. We have elaborate rites, a careful courtship, negotiations among families. My father entertains suitors for years sometimes before deciding on alliances that benefit the realm. Seeing me at the sacred spring is, well, it's considered a cosmic sign that outranks all those typical customs." He studied her for a moment, sympathy welling in him. "I can't imagine you're thrilled. I'm an off-worlder, after all. That can't exactly play well in your father's diplomatic strategies." A faint laugh bubbled up from her chest. "You'd be surprised at how many Terran and Aurelian alliances my father tries to cultivate. But none of them involved his daughter in quite this way." They were both silent a moment, the hush broken only by the gentle hum of circulating air and the distant echoes of palace life. At length, Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You said we need to explain us. I take it that means a formal approach to your father. You think he'll enforce your laws, go through with this forced marriage, or else, despite the massive political fallout?" Her expression was solemn. "He might not have a choice. He's the High Counselor, which means he is the top custodian of our traditions. If he bends the rules for me, it undermines centuries of legal precedent. The council would see it as favoritism or hypocrisy. There's a political balancing act in play." Ethan raked a hand through his hair, the dryness of the planet's air making his scalp itch. "So I have to brace myself for a public hearing, or something like it?" Nalia nodded reluctantly. "Yes, there will be a formal convening of the council. But before that, we must at least try to acclimate you. Many of our laws are unfamiliar to humans, and we have to ensure you don't unwittingly cause more breaches of protocol. Also, I fear there are factions who might be opposed to any union that introduces outside blood into our lineage." A sudden chime at the chamber's entrance made both of them tense. Nalia stood and motioned Ethan behind a carved partition adorned with iridescent shells. She swiftly adjusted the towel around her shoulders, then walked to the door. When it slid open with a whisper of displaced air, Ethan risked peeking over the edge of the partition to see who had arrived. A middle-aged Aurelian woman in richly embroidered robes bowed deeply. "Princess, your father requests your presence in the Great Hall. He has been informed of your return to the palace and wishes to discuss urgent matters." Nalia offered a poised nod. "Tell him I will be there as soon as I have changed and regained my composure." The woman's gaze flickered momentarily, taking in Nalia's damp hair and towel. If she suspected anything unusual, she did not show it. "As you wish, Princess Nalia." She backed out gracefully, the door sliding shut. Once they were alone, Ethan exhaled in relief. "I suppose the illusions of normalcy won't last long." Nalia retrieved a golden gem-encrusted device from a small stand beside the dais. Ethan recognized it as a local communicator, akin to the Terran Riscom. She tapped a sequence of symbols, presumably sending messages or checking something. "No, it won't. My father's personal summons means he's already aware something unusual transpired in the restricted area. The temple guards must have reported their suspicions." Ethan nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "Then I won't hide here. Not if we're supposed to face this head-on. When do we go to him?" "As soon as you can look presentable," Nalia replied, eyeing his dusty armor. "I have a wardrobe of local garments you might wear, though I don't know if they'll fit you exactly. We can also have some of our tailors come, though that will certainly invite questions." "Maybe just dusting off will do," Ethan said. I said, "I want to approach this meeting looking like what I am, a Terran diplomat who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. If we show them we're hiding nothing, that might lessen any rumors." Nalia raised a brow, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You're surprisingly optimistic for someone who's about to be thrown into the deep end of Aurelian law." He gave a wry shrug. "I've been through my share of deep ends, Princess. I might sink or swim, but I won't sink quietly." Her smile widened for an instant before she sobered again. "All right, let's prepare. The Great Hall is a formal place, so remember to keep your posture regal and your words measured. Aurelians value decorum almost as much as they value tradition." With that, they set about making themselves as respectable as the situation allowed. Nalia stepped into an alcove curtained off by shimmering beads and emerged a few minutes later in a flowing silver gown. It caught the chamber's soft light, reflecting it in subtle ways that accentuated her lithe frame. She also brushed out her damp hair, twisting it into a loose braid that framed her high cheekbones. Ethan, by contrast, had only a short time to peel away the outer layer of his armor, remove dust from his undertunic, and attempt to straighten himself out. Despite his best efforts, he looked every inch the weary traveler. Nalia approached him wearing a cautious yet determined expression. "Shall we? The next steps we take will determine not just our fate, but the relationship between our worlds." They navigated a series of wide corridors illuminated by wall sconces made from lustrous, shell-like materials. The palace's architecture was a masterpiece of crystal and stone, each pillar carved with flowing patterns that seemed almost alive in the ambient light. Sculpted balconies overlooked gardens of bioluminescent flora, while occasional overhead archways were adorned with intricate mosaics depicting Aurelian heroes of legend. As they approached the Great Hall, the sounds of low, formal conversation reached Ethan's ears. A sense of gravity seemed to settle over him, and he realized that he was about to take part in an audience with the planet's most powerful leaders, under the worst possible circumstances. He kept his chin up and posture straight, trying to channel the diplomatic grace that had carried him through many fraught negotiations back in Terran space. Nalia led him through ornate double doors, each pane a stained glass depiction of star clusters that glowed softly. The Great Hall itself was a vast expanse of polished marble floors, tall crystal columns, and an arched ceiling that sparkled like an inverted night sky. A ring of seats, some kind of council dais, surrounded a central platform. At the platform's center stood a tall Aurelian man with a commanding presence, robed in deep azure and crowned with a circlet of shimmering metal. Even without an introduction, Ethan knew this had to be High Counselor Turson, Nalia's father and the most influential figure on Aurelia Prime. A hush fell over the chamber as soon as Ethan and Nalia stepped onto the platform. The counselors and advisors present all turned, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, disapproval, and carefully managed neutrality. At a glance, Ethan could sense the tension in the air. Nalia, the High Counselor, spoke, his voice carrying an air of both warmth and reproach. Word has reached me that you conducted a private cleansing at the Celestine Springs. I was not aware you were scheduled for a purification ritual today. Nalia held her head high. Father, events transpired unexpectedly. You were seen returning in haste, another counselor interjected, glaring at Ethan. Who is this Terran you bring to our midst in such a secretive manner? Ethan cleared his throat, bowing slightly in the Terran custom of respect. Commander Ethan Rivers, Ambassador of the Terran Confederacy. I apologize for any offense I may have caused. My presence near the sacred springs was unintentional. A ripple of murmurs swept the hall. Turson studied Ethan with a gaze that was impossible to read, then focused on his daughter. Is it true? Did he see you in the waters? Nalia hesitated only for a second. Yes, Father, by happenstance. But according to our laws, once seen, a tall, austere figure in burgundy robes stepped forward, clearly another influential council member. The old ways are clear. If a stranger gazes upon one of noble blood in the sanctified waters, the consequence is a forced union. If that union is refused, both the observer and the observed must face execution to cleanse the dishonor from our land. Ethan felt a dozen pairs of eyes fix on him, waiting for his reaction. His mind raced. Here he was, forced into a life-or-death arrangement he barely understood, while also needing to maintain the Terran Confederacy's standing with Aurelia Prime. He tried not to let the dread show on his face. Counselors, he began with as much composure as he could summon. This was an accident. Neither the princess nor I intended for any sacred tradition to be violated. My people hold your culture in the highest regard. The High Counselor's posture remained rigid, though his eyes flicked between Ethan and his daughter, revealing the hint of an internal conflict. The law is ancient, Turson said slowly. I fear we may have no choice but to uphold it. We cannot allow even a rumor of disregard for our traditions. Nalia closed her eyes for a moment, then met Ethan's gaze. In that shared look, they both understood that their fates were now entangled in a way neither had foreseen, and they had mere hours, if even that long, to decide how to face an ultimatum that offered only two outcomes, marriage or death. The moment the High Counselor declared their predicament, an uneasy stir rippled through the great hall. Princess Nalia stood regally at Ethan's side, but he could sense the tension in every line of her posture. His own heartbeat thudded in his ears. He reminded himself he was, above all else, a Terran ambassador sworn to uphold the values of peaceful cooperation. Yet in this moment, diplomacy felt secondary to the stark reality of survival. The law demanded marriage, or a far darker fate. To Ethan's relief, Counselor Saphir, a relatively young member of the ruling body, stepped forward, his posture less rigid than that of his elders. High Counselor Turson, he said in a measured tone, we would be remiss if we did not consider the extraordinary circumstances. Perhaps we can convene a special inquiry to ensure we fully understand this incident before enforcing punishment. A few members of the council murmured agreement, though one older woman in a crimson stole snapped, the law is quite clear, Saphir. Any violation of the sacred spring is punishable by execution if the bond is not accepted. This outsider, her gaze flicked to Ethan, has chosen a path that endangers our princess. That we even discuss an alternative is bending the rules already. Nalia took a subtle step forward. Elder Kalen, if I may, Ethan did not come to our sacred spring by choice, nor did I invite him there. You accuse him of endangering me, but in truth, we both fell victim to forces beyond our control. My father once told me that laws exist not just to punish wrongdoing, but to guide us toward balance. She allowed herself a quiet pause, letting her words resonate. Is it truly balanced to enforce an irreversible sentence on two souls, one of them Aurelian nobility, whose only crime was an accidental meeting? Her measured plea elicited a few nods of respect from the council members. Ethan, watching the subtle shifts in the group, realized Nalia was not only a princess by title, she was skilled in persuasion. High Counselor Turson raised a hand, and the murmurs died at once. He had the gravity of a leader accustomed to final authority. We will not dismiss ancient statutes. However, I agree that these are unusual circumstances. A Terran stepping unknowingly into the sacred waters has likely never happened before. His eyes fell on Ethan. Ambassador Rivers, you will be placed under palace supervision until a formal inquiry is arranged. During that time, any attempt to flee the premises will confirm your guilt in the eyes of the council. Do you understand? Ethan inclined his head. I do, High Counselor. I have no desire to flee. I only ask for fair consideration, so that I may maintain the diplomatic duties I came here to fulfill. A faint flicker of approval crossed Turson's stern features. Very well. Counselor Saffer, you will oversee the preliminary investigation. Princess Nalia, you will remain available for testimony. That is all. With that, the tension in the chamber seemed to exhale. Guards stepped forward, and although they did not place Ethan in manacles, their presence was as binding as any iron chain. Their message was clear. He would not be free to wander as he pleased. Meanwhile, Nalia's expression grew uncertain, as though she too recognized that whatever path they were on had now become impossible to avoid. The guards escorted Ethan and Nalia through a long corridor leading toward a more secluded wing of the palace. As they walked, Ethan stole glances at the princess, searching her face for signs of anger, fear, or regret. Instead, she seemed composed, her gaze fixed on the opulent halls, her back straight, each stride measured. Occasionally, he caught her glancing at him from the corner of her eye, but she said nothing. They arrived at a suite of rooms that appeared far grander than any typical prison cell. One of the guards, who introduced himself as Captain Rowan, cleared his throat. Ambassador Rivers, the High Counselor has decided you are to remain here under close watch until the inquiry commences. Princess Nalia has permission to come and go, but is expected to remain nearby for questioning. Nalia nodded curtly. Thank you, Captain. As soon as the guards withdrew, leaving 2 sentries posted outside, she turned to Ethan. My father's choice is unusual. Typically, a suspect would be held in a holding chamber under the palace, not in guest quarters. This suggests he's open to a more diplomatic resolution. Ethan scanned the room. Large windows overlooked a courtyard filled with exotic glowing vines, while tapestries of celestial motifs draped the walls. It was comfortable, almost inviting. Yet the presence of armed sentries made it clear that comfort did not equate to freedom. I appreciate that he trusts I'm not here as some saboteur, Ethan replied. Still, it's hard to ignore the fact that I'm effectively under house arrest until they decide whether to marry me off or kill me. She grimaced. I know how it sounds, but I promise you, not all Aurelians are so rigid. We are a people of ancient customs, yes, but our society also prides itself on blending heritage with progress. My father has pushed for many reforms in the past, often meeting resistance. In a strange way, your situation might become the catalyst for more modern thinking, if we navigate it properly. Ethan released a harsh breath. That's assuming the council doesn't decide to make an example of me, or that the more conservative members don't sabotage any chance at compromise. This forced marriage angle, is it truly so ironclad? No disclaimers, no exception for ambassadors? Nalia met his gaze firmly. Not in any documented case. But that's the key word, documented. As far as I know, we have never encountered a scenario involving a Terran diplomat stumbling upon a princess's ritual. If there's a loophole, we'll have to create it. Meanwhile, we must appear cooperative. The last thing we want is to give reason for immediate punishment. And what about you? He asked gently. This affects your life just as much, maybe more. You'd be forced to share your household, your future, with a man you barely know. She exhaled slowly, clearly wrestling with her own emotions. I'm still processing. I harbor no ill will toward you, Ethan, but I can't pretend it isn't jarring. My entire path was set toward political alliances, suitors from noble families. Now I'm told destiny has different plans. A marriage formed by an accidental glimpse at the sacred spring. Her face softened. But I'm not without choice. If I oppose this union, then, well, you know what the alternative is. He swallowed hard. The unspoken threat of execution lingered like a dark cloud. I guess we're in this together for better or worse. Over the next few hours, Palace attendants discreetly arrived to bring fruit-laced beverages and delicately prepared meals. Trays of roasted vegetables, spiced grains, and local fish with a distinctly sweet aroma. Ethan sampled the cuisine with guarded curiosity, mindful that Aurelian dishes tended to be heavier on floral and mineral notes. Nalia joined him, though her appetite was limited, likely due to the pressure of their circumstances. At intervals, Captain Rowan or one of his guards would appear to relay updates from Counselor Saphir's ongoing investigation. Little of substance was shared, other than the fact that multiple temple guards were being questioned about what they saw near the spring. Word had also spread among the city's populace that a scandal was brewing. Rumors circulated faster than official statements could contain them. Whispers of the Terran intruder and the besmirched princess echoed through the corridors, turning every corner of the palace into a hotbed of speculation. In the suite sitting room, Ethan and Nalia sat opposite each other on cushioned benches. A decorative crystal orb lay on a low table, pulsing gently with an inner light that responded to movement or touch. He turned it in his hands, marveling at the swirling patterns it displayed. I've seen many advanced technologies across the galaxy, but nothing like this. Is it purely decorative? She offered a small smile. That orb is an emotional conduit, crafted generations ago by our artisans. It resonates with the energies of living beings. In ancient times, it was used as a meditation tool or to gauge a child's temperament. Under her gaze, Ethan rotated the orb again, noticing how the pinkish hue brightened when he felt a pang of anxiety. Incredible! Terrans don't have much technology that directly interacts with emotions. Mind if I ask, did you expect me to be different? Nalia considered her answer, her braided hair draped over one shoulder. I knew humans were physically robust, born on a world with rigorous climates. I also knew you tend to be adaptable, sometimes shockingly so. But I didn't expect your sense of honor. You could have tried to deny what happened or flee the moment you realized the consequences. Yet you stayed. I find that admirable. He set the orb down, the reflection of shifting lights dancing across his armor's surface. In my line of work, running isn't usually an option, though I'd be lying if I said I'm not terrified of how this could end. There was a thickness in his throat, the reality of possible execution if he and Nalia couldn't find a middle path weighed heavily. The princess lowered her voice, leaning closer. Ethan, I have an idea. Our laws about the sacred spring revolve around the concept of unveiling one's essence. If we can prove that your accidental sight of me was itself an act of cosmic fate rather than disrespect, it might open a path to acceptance without a forced union, or at least temper the punishments. There's a group of holy figures known as the Oracular Circle. Their leader, an elder named Ninrai, can interpret omens from the waters themselves. He raised his brows. Like a spiritual or religious authority? Would they outrank the council's decision? Not necessarily, Nalia said, but their proclamations carry immense weight in our culture. If Ninrai decrees that we were brought together by a higher design, then it's possible the council will be compelled to consider a compromise. Ethan nodded slowly. Any chance your father would allow such an interpretation to override the letter of the law? The corner of Nalia's mouth quirked. My father respects the oracular circle deeply. At the very least, he might be swayed, but we should prepare for the possibility that Ninray's reading could confirm the bond is valid, and that might make the council push even harder for the marriage. Before they could strategize further, Captain Rowan knocked politely at the suite's main door and stepped inside. He bowed to Nalia first, then addressed Ethan with crisp formality. Ambassador Rivers, the counselor overseeing the inquiry requests your presence for an initial interview. Her Holiness Ninrai will also be attending. Nalia and Ethan exchanged tense looks. If that wasn't destiny prompting a swift turn of events, it was at least an uncanny coincidence. We'll come at once, Nalia said, rising with a whisper of silk from her gown. Moments later, they were walking down a different set of corridors than before, narrower and more sparsely decorated. The energy in the air felt subdued, the lighting dimmer, and the only sound was the echo of footsteps. Eventually, they reached a circular chamber lined with columns carved in the likeness of aquatic creatures, tendrils of stone that resembled sea plants or mythic serpents. Seated on a dais in the middle of this chamber was Ninray, an elderly Aurelian whose skin had a translucence to it, as though lit from within by a gentle glow. Her gray-white hair fell in braided loops around her shoulders, and her robes bore intricate patterns that seemed to shift like living ink. At her side stood Counselor Saphir, offering a respectful bow to Nalia and an acknowledging nod to Ethan. "Your Holiness," Nalia said, bowing in return, "thank you for agreeing to see us on short notice." Ninray's voice was reedy yet penetrating, resonating in the hush of the room. "Princess, I have heard troubling news about the sacred spring, an unexpected meeting, and a revelation that binds two souls. We must discern whether this is the will of the cosmos or a grievous mistake." Her gaze slid toward Ethan, eyes as pale as morning fog. "Your aura is unfamiliar to me, Terran." He dipped his head. "Ambassador Ethan Rivers, at your service, Holy One. I apologize if my presence has caused disruption." "Disruption can be a catalyst for change," Ninray replied cryptically, lifting a gnarled hand. "Come forward, both of you." Ethan glanced at Nalia, who appeared uneasy but determined. They stepped up onto the dais, where a shallow basin carved of shimmering stone stood between them and Ninray. The basin was filled with a clear, gently rippling liquid that Ethan guessed might be water from the sacred springs. "Place your hands over the pool," Ninray instructed. "Let the energies mingle." In times long past, it was through these waters that truths were revealed, truths of heart and spirit, free from the constraints of mortal secrets. Nalia gave Ethan a small nod, and they each extended a hand above the basin, palms hovering inches from the surface. Ethan felt a warmth emanating from the water, as though the liquid itself were alive. Ninray leaned forward, eyes half-lidded in concentration. Counselor Saphir folded his arms, observing intently. "Your Holiness, the Council must have clarity. Is this bond legitimate, or is it a hapless error that must be resolved through punitive means?" For a long moment no one spoke. Ethan's pulse throbbed in his temples, and he sensed Nalia's unease. Beneath their hands, the ripples in the water grew more pronounced, swirling in concentric patterns of light. Then, with a quiet gasp, Ninray's eyes flew open. A collective hush fell over the chamber as Ninray moved her hands in a slow, deliberate circle above the basin. The water began to glow, its surface becoming a shifting tapestry of luminous symbols Ethan could neither recognize nor fully describe. It was as if the pool were projecting fragments of cosmic language, shapes that glided and transformed from one form to another. Ninray spoke, her voice softer now but carrying a deep resonance. Two threads from distant worlds, converging in a moment of unguarded truth. The reflection is not a mere accident of circumstance. The waters reveal a confluence of destinies. Her gaze traveled from Nalia to Ethan. "You have been seen by the springs and have seen each other in the springs' domain. The law states you are bound." A wave of conflicting emotions rushed over Ethan, relief that Ninray did not condemn him outright as a desecrator, but also fresh anxiety because her words reinforced the bond as legitimate. If the oracular circle declared it destiny, then the council would likely insist on following the ancient edicts to the letter. Counselor Saphir, maintaining a neutral expression, stepped closer. "Holy One, if the bond is deemed true, then no legal remedy can sever it except—" He hesitated, well aware of the lethal alternative. "Yes, except death," Ninray confirmed quietly. She turned to Nalia. "Child, I sense at your heart's turmoil. You did not ask for this union. You only fulfilled a personal right. But the waters do not yield to personal preference. They speak to cosmic alignment. Would you deny what they have shown?" Nalia's breath caught, and for a moment, Ethan saw the flicker of doubt cross her face. Then she set her jaw. "I respect the water's wisdom, Holy One. However, I ask you to consider that I and Ambassador Rivers come from different worlds, different customs. Can the cosmic alignment truly bridge such a divide?" Ninray's lip curled in a faint smile. "Differences of flesh and tradition matter little to the springs, my dear. They care only for the sincerity of heart and the clarity of spirit. That said, forging a true bond requires more than a shared moment of spiritual exposure. It requires commitment to each other's well-being." She looked upon both of them. In time, the bond may deepen, or it may break under strain. But legally, from this moment forth, the path of union is the only path to preserve both your lives. Saphir exhaled. "So it is confirmed. The union stands under Aurelian law. I shall relay this to the High Counselor." Arrangements must be made. Nalia's grip on Ethan's hand tightened reflexively. He felt a surge of sympathy for her. They were now locked on a collision course with tradition, one that might have repercussions far beyond their personal fates. What kind of arrangements? Ethan ventured to ask. Oh, Sapphire's expression was both apologetic and formal. An official ceremony will be required, performed by the oracular circle and sanctioned by the council. It must be done soon, within days, if not sooner, to ensure no further dishonor touches the royal lineage. The vow you take will bind you in the eyes of Aurelia Prime. Any refusal is punishable as an act of defiance against our deepest spiritual laws. Ethan exchanged a look with Nalia. It was as though the floor had dropped beneath them, leaving them with no safe footing. Their uneasy alliance, born out of a single accidental glance, had transformed into a forced promise of a lifetime, and any attempt to escape it would spell their end. The shock of Ninray's declaration was still fresh in Ethan's mind when they returned to the palace corridors, flanked by guards. Counselor Saphir walked ahead, presumably headed to inform High Counselor Turson of the oracular circle's pronouncement. Every step echoed with the weight of what had just transpired. Ethan resisted the urge to stop in the middle of the hallway and shout at the impossibility of it all. Marrying an Aurelian princess he'd only met hours before? It was beyond any scenario his diplomatic training had prepared him for. He risked a sideways glance at Nalia, who kept her gaze fixed on the polished floor. Even in her subdued posture, she exuded a quiet dignity. A twisted mixture of admiration and pity coursed through him. Admiration for her composure and pity, because she too was trapped in a predicament not of her choosing. As they approached the guest suite, Captain Rowan stepped aside to allow them entry. Once the door sealed shut, Nalia drew in a shuddering breath, leaning against the nearest wall. "It's official now," she whispered, eyes closed. "We're locked in. There's no turning back." Ethan found himself wanting to offer some kind of comfort. He removed his gauntlets and set them on a table, moving closer to her. "Are you all right?" "Strangely enough, I'm more worried for you," she said, opening her eyes to regard him. "If you were an Aurelian noble, the council would welcome this union as a mere twist in political alliances. But you're human, and many within our society still distrust off-worlders. The law states we're bound, yet there will be those who question whether you're worthy of such a role or if you're just an opportunist who took advantage of tradition." "Wonderful," Ethan muttered. As if the threat of execution wasn't bad enough, now I get to deal with cultural suspicion and hostility. Nalia managed a small, sad laugh. "It's not all Aurelians who think that way. There's a growing faction, especially among the younger generation, that sees Terrans as allies and potential partners in technology, science, and trade. Yet the old guard holds enormous sway over legal matters, and they are resistant to any change that threatens long-standing customs." Ethan mulled that over, running a hand across his short, dark hair. "Then we'll have to show them that bridging our worlds can be beneficial. Isn't that what my mission was in the first place? Establishing better relations between Aurelia Prime and the Terran Confederacy?" "Yes," she conceded. "But I doubt you expected to establish relations in such a literal sense." Despite the grim situation, Ethan almost smiled. "True enough, but maybe this is fate's version of a fast-track solution." His attempt at levity fell flat, and his voice sobered. "Look, if we go through with this marriage, we might leverage it to promote unity between our peoples. A cross-cultural union could stand as a powerful symbol, so long as we handle the politics carefully." Nalia cocked her head, curiosity evident in her eyes. "You would actually consider doing this willingly? I assumed you'd treat it like a prison sentence." He sighed. "I won't lie, it's not exactly my dream scenario, but if the alternative is both of us getting killed, I'll choose marriage any day. Besides, you don't deserve to die for something that was my blunder. And let's be honest, if your father can spin this into a diplomatic triumph, then maybe my superiors back on Terra will see the value too." She listened, a flicker of hope mingling with the tension in her face. "You're quite remarkable, Ethan. Most people in your position would be furious, ranting about injustice." "I am furious," he said quietly, "but I also recognize we're dealing with forces, laws, traditions, beliefs that have shaped your world for centuries. Barging in with Terran arrogance won't help. Better to adapt, find a path that yields the best outcome for everyone." Nalia pushed off from the wall, a tentative resolve appearing in her gaze. Then let's do it. Let's face the ceremony together, demonstrate good faith, and then figure out how to navigate the rest of our lives. Neither admitted it aloud, but they both knew they were stepping into a maelstrom of uncertainty, a future forced upon them by the ancient laws of the sacred springs, overshadowed by potential political backlash, yet holding a faint promise of forging something new in the unlikeliest of circumstances. Within a day, the palace was abuzz with preparations. Maids and stewards flitted through halls carrying bolts of ornate fabric, trays of exotic flowers, and glittering crystals that refracted the morning light. Word had spread that the princess's union was to be formalized, and that her partner was a Terran. Reactions ranged from fascination to outrage, with some corners of the city whispering that the union was a sign of a new era, while others raged about the desecration of Aurelian purity. Ethan had little time to dwell on these rumors as tailors and attendants fussed over his attire. They insisted on dressing him in a hybrid style that combined Aurelian's ceremonial robes with the sleek lines of his Terran uniform. The result felt odd at first. He was used to functional armor, not layered fabrics and decorative collars. Yet as he caught his reflection in a tall mirror, he had to admit the outfit was strangely regal, blending both worlds in its design. For Nalia, the transformation was even more striking. Gone was her simple silver gown. In its place, she wore a draping ensemble of translucent blue over a fitted underlayer of white, evoking the colors of the sacred spring. Her braided hair had been elaborately woven with delicate crystals that shimmered with her every movement. Observing her, Ethan couldn't help but feel a moment of genuine awe. She looked every inch the princess, yet beneath that poised exterior was a woman whose fate was being rewritten by forces outside her control. They were ushered to a grand hall in the palace's eastern wing, large enough to accommodate hundreds of guests and officials. Massive windows overlooked sculpted gardens, allowing shafts of golden sunlight to illuminate the polished floors. Counselor Saphir stood at the far end, speaking to a small group of robed individuals who, Ethan guessed, were from the oracular circle. Ninray was among them, her presence solemn yet calm. High Counselor Turson presided from a raised platform. His face was etched with a mixture of paternal concern and official gravitas. Surrounding him were other counselors, some wearing carefully neutral expressions, others barely masking their distaste. A hush settled when Nalia and Ethan arrived, flanked by ceremonial guards in polished armor. This day, Turson began, addressing the assembly, we witness a union decreed by the sacred waters themselves. Princess Nalia Turson, beloved daughter of the realm, and Ambassador Ethan Rivers of Terra have been bound by an ancient rite. Though their meeting was not planned, it has been affirmed by the oracular circle that destiny weaves their paths together. A hum of conversation rose and fell. Ethan swallowed, aware of the many eyes upon him. Even after all the diplomatic receptions he had attended in his career, he had never felt scrutiny quite this personal. With the authority vested in me by our laws and tradition, Turson continued, I call upon the blessing of the waters, the endorsement of the oracular circle, and the goodwill of all in attendance. Let the ceremony commence. As Ethan and Nalia took their positions at the center of the chamber, they both braced themselves, not just for the vows that would bind them, but for the unknown challenges awaiting once the ceremonial veil was lifted. The day of the union arrived in a whirlwind of ceremonial detail. Soft choral music, produced by crystal instruments unique to Aurelia Prime, echoed within the vaulted hall where Ethan and Nalia stood side by side. The oracular circle, led by Ninray, presided at one end of the dais, each member robed in patterns that glowed like living constellations. Despite the splendor, an undercurrent of tension ran through the gathering. Court functionaries shifted uneasily, aware of the controversy stirred by this forced marriage. Yet tradition demanded they honor the words of the sacred springs and the oracular circle's decree. High Counselor Turson rose from his ornate seat, his posture composed but his gaze flicking with both paternal warmth and political caution. We gather under the sight of two worlds today, he intoned, voice carrying across the assembled guests. On one side, Aurelia Prime, with its ancient beliefs and spiritual alignment. On the other, Terra, home to our ally, whose ambassador has shown us the importance of adaptability and honor. He paused, eyes resting on Ethan and Nalia. In the name of the law, both old and newly interpreted, we recognize the bond that has been decreed by the springs. Let this union stand as testament to the possibility of unity between our peoples. A quiet ripple of commentary passed among the guests. Some Aurelian nobles glared, their expressions betraying disapproval at what they viewed as a breach of custom. Others watched with curiosity or even guarded hope, intrigued by the prospect of forging a deeper alliance with humankind. Nalia felt the weight of expectation pressing upon her. She glanced sideways at Ethan, who stood in dignified silence, and found solace in his calm presence. Though they were bound by necessity, some part of her admired his unwavering resilience. Ninray stepped forward, her soft gray eyes reflecting the ceremony's gravity. She beckoned Ethan and Nalia closer to a basin of crystalline water placed before them. By the light of the cosmos and the truth of the springs, we sanctify this union, she said, gesturing for them to place a hand into the water. The moment their palms dipped in, concentric rings of iridescent light spread across the surface as though responding to their contact. A few gasps sounded through the hall, for it was rare indeed to see the waters resonate so visibly in a public space. In the hush that followed, Ethan allowed his gaze to shift from the glowing water to Nalia's face. There was no mistaking the tension around her eyes, but there was also resolve. Whatever else might be said of her, she possessed a regal composure he found both impressive and strangely reassuring. Their vows, recited in a blend of Terran and Aurelian languages, sealed the union. Each word was carefully chosen to bridge the stark differences in cultural tradition. By the time they finished, the basin's glow subsided, and Ninrai pronounced them wedded in the eyes of Aurelia Prime. Polite applause followed, subdued and laden with mixed emotions. High Counselor Turson offered his formal blessing, and the oracular circle bowed in acknowledgement. As the crowd dispersed, Ethan and Nalia stood together, a swirl of conflicting thoughts shared between them. The first step in their coerced marriage had been taken, but the true challenge was just beginning. Even as the final echoes of the wedding ceremony died away, a second wave of curiosity, almost a frenzy, descended on the palace. There were formal receptions to attend, congratulatory audiences, and endless ceremonial gestures. In principle, these gatherings were meant to legitimize Ethan's presence in Aurelian society and demonstrate that Nalia's union with a Terran ambassador was accepted. In practice, they became an arena for subtle political maneuvers. Courtiers approached Ethan with guarded smiles, pressing for details on Terran trade policies or hinting at new alliances that might benefit their personal interests. Meanwhile, a contingent of younger Aurelians, wearing excited expressions, seemed genuinely thrilled by the spectacle of an interspecies union. They peppered Ethan with questions about Terran life, eager to learn about agriculture, technology, or art forms from far-flung human colonies. Some even speculated that this marriage might herald the dawn of a more inclusive era, bridging the gap between Aurelia Prime and off-world communities. Nalia listened with cautious optimism. She had not expected her forced bond to spark such a wave of curiosity. Perhaps there was a silver lining in their predicament after all. However, in the quieter corners of the palace, not everyone was pleased. Whispers circulated of discontent among certain noble houses who saw the union as a corruption of Aurelian bloodlines. Ethan heard rumors that Lady Orva, a wealthy matriarch from the eastern provinces, had been lobbying other aristocrats to denounce the marriage publicly. Confrontations remained mostly veiled, limited to disapproving glances or pointed remarks about outsider interference. Still, the hostility felt tangible enough that Ethan remained vigilant, especially when Nalia was not at his side. One afternoon, several days after the ceremony, he received an unexpected summons from High Counselor Turson. The messenger escorted him to a private study illuminated by tall windows. Shelves lined the walls, filled with ancient texts, star charts, and official edicts from generations of rulers. Turson stood behind a polished wooden desk, his hands clasped behind his back. When Ethan entered, the older man gestured for him to sit. "Ambassador Rivers," Turson began, his manner formal but not unkind, "I wanted to speak with you privately. For all your confidence, you find yourself in a precarious position here. Some among the nobility question my decision to uphold the Springs Law when it involves a Terran. They believe I should have intervened differently, or not at all." Ethan nodded. "I'm aware of the opposition. With all due respect, High Counselor, if your law says that a sacred bond is formed by this chance encounter, I don't see how you could have intervened without discrediting your own traditions. A faint smile played on Turson's lips. Precisely. And so here we stand, bound by the very customs that now pit us against those who fear change. His expression grew more solemn. I must ask, though, how do you view this marriage? To my daughter, to this entire situation? I need to know your true intentions. The question felt heavy with paternal concern and political tension. Choosing his words carefully, Ethan met Turson's gaze. I never sought to exploit Aurelian traditions, but given the circumstances, I accept what has happened. I respect Princess Nalia deeply. If she's willing to make the best of our union, then so am I. And if it can strengthen relations between our worlds, all the better. Turson studied him, then nodded. Very well. Let us hope our endeavors are guided by wisdom rather than fear. In the weeks following the wedding, Ethan and Nalia found themselves navigating an uneasy domestic routine within the palace walls. They occupied a grand set of chambers with interlinked rooms, originally designed for a royal couple whose marriage was arranged under more conventional circumstances. Polished floors, draped silks, and decorative screens lent a regal flourish to their new living space. Yet the atmosphere crackled with tension whenever they were alone, both of them unsure how to balance personal boundaries with the ceremonial closeness demanded by tradition. Surprisingly, Nalia proved a patient guide, teaching Ethan the subtleties of Aurelian etiquette. She showed him how to greet various officials according to rank, how to interpret the shifting patterns of the crystal orbs used in spiritual practices, and even how to properly address the staff, who, despite the marriage, remained somewhat uncertain about how to serve a Terran. In turn, Ethan shared stories of Terran worlds he had visited, from the frozen outposts of Polaris Station to the lush farmland of Grayson Colony. Gradually, their initial wariness began to transform into a form of guarded companionship, yet the greater intrigue lay outside their chambers. Counselor Saphir continued his investigation into the circumstances surrounding the union, which had turned into a broader inquiry about the palace's factions. Multiple witnesses came forward to confirm that Ethan's presence at the sacred spring was accidental and that Nalia had acted swiftly to prevent a violent confrontation. While some in the nobility accepted these findings, rumors persisted that a clandestine group sought to overturn the oracular circle's decree by any means necessary. A handful of officials who privately favored isolationist policies appeared particularly riled at the possibility of an outsider influencing the line of royal succession. One evening, Nalia and Ethan were summoned again, this time to meet with oracular elder Ninrai in a secluded garden courtyard. The space was lit by dozens of floating lanterns that drifted through the air like glowing jellyfish. Ninrai stood beneath a flowering tree, its blooms shimmering with luminescent pollen. She greeted them with a thoughtful nod. I asked you both here because the waters have shown me more than just a binding. They reveal potential, possibilities of a deeper convergence between Terran and Aurelian lineages. Nalia tilted her head, her expression alert. What do you mean by deeper convergence? Ninrai's pale eyes flicked to Ethan. When our priest tested your compatibility, ensuring that you could fulfill the bond physically and spiritually, strange patterns emerged. Patterns suggesting your union may yield an offspring unlike any we have seen. A slight smile curved on her lips. Life is rarely so convenient as prophecy makes it sound, but the waters insist something monumental is at play. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. A child? The notion made him break into a cold sweat. He thought back to the night of the ceremony and the subsequent evenings spent sharing uncertain but growing intimacy with Nalia. Could it be possible that they were already forging a future that neither had anticipated? He risked a glance at Nalia, whose cheeks had flushed a rosy hue under the lantern light. How certain is this? She asked, voice trembling just enough for Ethan to notice. Ninrai's expression was serene. Certainty is seldom absolute, Princess, but the waters rarely lie about such matters. I advise caution, for if the rumor of a hybrid child spreads, those already opposed to this union will become desperate to keep our bloodlines pure. You must prepare for both wonder and danger to follow. The revelation from Ninrai cast a fresh layer of complication over Ethan and Nalia's life. They kept the oracle's words private for the moment, not even informing Turson or Counselor Saphir. Neither felt ready to confront the storm that would surely follow if talk of a royal hybrid birth seeped into public discourse. Still, the possibility loomed in their thoughts, influencing every choice they made. Behind palace doors, the tension among the nobility grew more pronounced. Lady Orva and several other staunch traditionalists convened secret gatherings, evidently determined to undermine Ethan's position. Rumor had it they were trying to invoke archaic statutes that could annul a sacred spring marriage, though no one had used such laws for centuries. Whenever Nalia passed Orva in the corridors, the older woman would offer a brittle smile that failed to hide her contempt. For his part, Ethan steered clear of direct confrontations, knowing full well that aggression would only reinforce the worst assumptions about Terrans. Meanwhile, Ethan's responsibilities as an ambassador resumed in cautious steps. He attended planning sessions about joint research projects and defense cooperation, endeavoring to show good faith in forging a true alliance. Some Aurelians warmed to him, impressed by his sincere dedication and his willingness to learn their customs. Others remained aloof or openly scornful. Nalia, whenever possible, sat alongside him during these meetings, lending her royal authority to keep proceedings civil. One afternoon, while Ethan was returning from a talk on Terran Aurelian trade prospects, he found himself intercepted in a deserted hallway by an unfamiliar figure. The man wore the muted grays of an off-duty guard, but there was a furtiveness in his gaze that put Ethan on edge. "Ambassador Rivers," the man said in a hushed tone, "I carry a message from those who believe your union may be a threat." Ethan tensed. "Is that so? They say this is your last chance to depart Aurelia Prime. If you leave quietly, the council might be persuaded to treat your accidental violation with leniency. But if you remain, especially if you think to continue this union, things will escalate. For your own sake, go." The bluntness of the threat made Ethan's anger flare. Still, he forced himself to stay calm. "I appreciate the warning," he said, "but you know as well as I do that fleeing would guarantee my execution under your laws, and put the princess in mortal danger as well. So consider this my polite refusal." The man's eyes darted, uncertain. Perhaps he had expected fear, or at least a willingness to bargain. When none appeared, he backed away without further argument, disappearing into the labyrinth of corridors. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his temples as the tension in his shoulders tightened. He was no stranger to threats, having navigated volatile negotiations on distant worlds. Yet this was more personal, entwined with the life of a woman he was beginning to understand and, on some level, care about. When he told Nolly about the exchange, she clasped his hand with quiet resolve. "They grow desperate," she said. "If we stand firm, we might force them into the open. But we must be vigilant. Not all will fight by honorable means." Ethan nodded grimly, aware that Aurelia Prime's greatest test of tradition versus progress might be fast approaching, and they were right at its center. Tensions came to a head one evening in the palace's grand reception hall, where a banquet had been organized to celebrate the formal renewal of a trade pact between Aurelia Prime and a visiting Terran envoy. The event was meant to show unity. Ethan's presence as a newly wedded Aurelian prince consort, albeit through an unconventional route, was intended to symbolize the two species growing closer. Rows of tables laden with jeweled fruits, spiced meats, and intricately carved pastries stretched beneath glowing chandeliers. A mixture of Terran representatives and Aurelian dignitaries mingled among the swirling musicians and swirling gowns. The calm facade lasted until halfway through the festivities, when Lady Orva made her dramatic entrance. Clad in crimson robes embroidered with swirling gold motifs, she cut a striking figure as she marched to the center of the hall and tapped a crystal staff sharply on the polished floor. Conversations died down instantly, all eyes turning to see what spectacle was about to unfold. "Honored guests," Orva declared, voice resonant, "I stand before you with a deep respect for our traditions, but I also bear grave concern. Our beloved princess has wed an off-worlder, violating the sanctity of our bloodlines for the first time in living memory. The oracular circle claims this union is blessed by the springs, yet I have discovered an ancient law that says otherwise. A law that permits severing such a bond if it's proven detrimental to the realm." A chorus of gasps and muttered exclamations erupted, especially among older nobles. Ethan and Nalia, who had been mingling with Terran guests, exchanged alarmed glances. Counselor Saphir, seated near the head table, immediately rose, his posture tense. Lady Orva, you speak of an archaic text that has never been applied in a recognized spring bond scenario. You risk inciting chaos. Orva's gaze swept the room, her expression triumphant. Chaos already reigns if we allow this unnatural union to stand unchallenged. Legends speak of artifacts hidden beneath the palace, relics with the power to break bonds even ordained by the springs. My followers and I shall do whatever is necessary to protect the purity of Aurelia Prime. At this, an uneasy stir rippled through the assembly. Guards shifted, uncertain whether to intervene. High Counselor Turson shot to his feet at the high table, expression thunderous. Lady Orva, your words border on sedition. The oracular circle's decree stands above such archaic manipulations, and the council has recognized the union as law. Orva gave a mocking bow. I mean no sedition, High Counselor, only the preservation of our people. If you wish to brand me a heretic, then so be it. But know this, I have supporters who will stand against this violation of our heritage. We will not submit to an off-world takeover. In that moment, Ethan understood how precarious their position truly was. While Orva's faction might be a minority, they were clearly emboldened. The threat was no longer confined to whispers or shadowy corridors. It was declared publicly before both Aurelians and Terrans. And if this rumor of ancient artifacts able to sever a sacred bond held any truth, Ethan and Nalia were at real risk, perhaps even physically, if the ritual had harmful effects. Before the tension could erupt into a brawl, Turson banged a ceremonial gavel against the high table, sending a shrill note across the hall. Enough, he roared. Guards, escort Lady Orva to the council chambers at once. This matter will be addressed through proper legal channels, not reckless pronouncements at a state banquet. A cluster of armed guards moved forward, flanking Orva. She did not resist, yet the satisfied glimmer in her eyes hinted she had already accomplished her goal, sowing doubt and fear about the Union and pointing a path for those who shared her convictions. The banquet ended in disarray, and by the following morning, talk of Lady Orva's confrontation had spread throughout the city. The tension lay thick in the palace halls, mirrored by the gloom in the skies outside. Aurelia Prime's weather systems were prone to swift changes in atmospheric phenomena, and now the twin suns were partially obscured by swirling clouds of indigo and silver, casting shifting shadows over the spired rooftops. In a private conference room, Ethan, Nalia, High Counselor Turson, and Counselor Saphir gathered to decide their next steps. No official charge had been filed against Orva beyond disturbing the peace, yet the threat of her faction lingered. A few Terran envoys, unsettled by the possibility of political violence, had subtly suggested withdrawing from the capital until the matter was resolved. But Turson firmly denied any notion of retreat, insisting the monarchy's authority remained unbroken. Nalia rubbed her temples, weariness etched on her features. We must find out if there's any factual basis to Orva's claim of an artifact that can sever the bond. If such an object exists, and if it's indeed capable of harming the bond recognized by the springs, we need to secure it. Counselor Saphir, seated next to her, tapped on a crystalline tablet displaying historical archives. Our records speak of the Sunder shards, relics from pre-orbital times. They were rumored to disrupt a person's spiritual alignment, particularly damaging to any link established by the sacred water. However, the last credible reference to them is well over 5 centuries old. Most historians believe they were destroyed or lost. He glanced at Ethan. But if Orva's faction has stumbled upon hidden texts or partial evidence, they might be scouring the old palace catacombs or abandoned temple sites. Turson let out a slow breath. Sealing off those areas would alarm the populace. We must proceed subtly. Saphir, assemble a discreet team to search for these shards, if they exist at all. And Nalia, I'd like you and Ambassador Rivers to keep a low profile. The city is rife with rumors. The fewer public appearances you make until this is resolved, the better. Ethan's jaw tightened. He was no coward, but the idea of going into hiding grated on him. High Counselor, with respect, if there are real danger here, then me staying hidden while these conspirators move freely only emboldens them. Couldn't I help in some way, perhaps assisting the team that investigates these catacombs? A flicker of gratitude crossed Nalia's face, but Turson shook his head. Your willingness is commendable, but you're also the prime target of Orva's rage. Should anything happen to you, Terra would never forgive us. Or worse, the law might interpret your harm as a sign the bond was violated. I cannot risk it. Nalia reached for Ethan's hand beneath the table, a brief gesture of unity amid their tense dilemma. We'll remain in the palace for now, but please keep us informed, Father. If we are not part of the search, at least allow us to prepare for what may come. With that plan tentatively set, the meeting concluded, leaving Ethan with a sense of restless dread. It seemed that the fate of not only their forced marriage, but also the broader alliance between Terra and Aurelia Prime now hinged on a race to uncover ancient relics, one that could end in revelations or destruction. Days passed in a swirl of cautious anticipation. Saphir's search parties methodically scoured ancient vaults and temple records, while Orva's supporters maintained a low profile in public. Rumors abounded that she and her cohorts had ventured into the restricted archives beneath the old palace, where crumbling passages led to half-forgotten shrines. Amid this tense waiting, Ethan and Nalia found themselves spending more time in each other's company than they ever expected. Partly out of the palace's security measures, partly from a growing sense that they needed one another's support. Paradoxically, that forced proximity deepened their bond in ways that transcended the initial, law-driven union. They discovered small pockets of laughter, cracking jokes about half-remembered Aurelian legends or Terran idioms that never translated neatly. In the early morning, Ethan would share coffee-like brews from his homeworld, and in the evenings, Nalia introduced him to the soothing, luminescent teas favored by her ancestors. Through hesitant conversation and moments of shared vulnerability, they began to see past the ceremonial roles thrust upon them, recognizing threads of genuine connection. That fragile peace shattered one night when an alarm resonated through the palace corridors, an eerie crystal chime that signaled a breach of the restricted underlevels. Guards sprinted past Ethan and Nalia's chambers, calling for reinforcements. Without waiting for official permission, Ethan grabbed a compact plasma pistol from his locked trunk, a concession to his diplomatic status, and followed the commotion. Nalia, adamant about not being left behind, accompanied him, though palace protocol ordinarily forbade her from entering potential combat zones. They descended a spiral staircase into the catacombs, guided by flickering lights and the distant shouts of guards. The air was musty, tinged with mineral dampness, and the narrow corridors felt claustrophobic under centuries-old arches. Eventually, they emerged into a larger chamber, scattered with overturned crates and broken relics. In the center stood Lady Orva, flanked by two conspirators, one of whom clutched a shard of crystalline substance that glowed with a dark, pulsating hue. "You dare come here?" Orva snapped, eyes wild. "You play at bridging our worlds, but you've brought only corruption. This artifact," she gestured at the shard, "will sever your unnatural bond, ridding our people of your influence forever. If the ritual does not tear you apart, it will at least unmake the false union that has shackled our princess." Ethan leveled his pistol, heart pounding. "Orva, this isn't just about me. You'd harm your own princess?" Nalia stepped forward, voice commanding despite her fear. "Stand down, Lady Orva. If you so much as attempt this dark ritual, you'll face the full wrath of the High Council and the oracular circle." But Orva only sneered. "The circle grows weak, clinging to half-truths and diluted faith. True Aurelians reclaim their birthright." She raised a trembling hand, chanting incantations in archaic language. The conspirator holding the shard advanced, and for an instant the glow intensified, emanating an invisible pressure that made Ethan stagger. From the corner of his eye, he saw Nalia grip her chest, her face contorted in sudden pain. Realizing there was no time for negotiation, Ethan fired a warning shot over Orva's shoulder, the plasma bolt sizzling against stone. Guards appeared at the chamber entrance, shouting for them to drop the relic. In the chaotic seconds that followed, Orva's accomplice tried to hurl the shard's energy toward Nalia, but Ethan lunged, knocking the conspirator's arm aside. A flash of malevolent light seared through the air, missing Nalia by a hair. Then the guards were upon the group, wrestling the artifact away. Orva shrieked in fury as she was disarmed, her final attempt to disrupt the marriage foiled. In the immediate aftermath, Nalia sank to her knees, breathing heavily. Ethan rushed to her side, relief surging through him. The forced bond that had once felt like a prison sentence now felt precious, something he would risk everything to protect. As the palace guards secured Orva and her conspirators, Ethan and Nalia helped each other back to their feet, both realizing that in the face of mortal danger, they had chosen to stand together. No longer strangers forced into a union, but partners in every sense of the word. Looking back on this incredible journey, from the tense moment at the sacred spring to the hard-won harmony now flourishing, it's clear that the power of understanding can overcome even the most unyielding traditions. Princess Nalia and Ambassador Ethan taught us that cultural barriers do not have to be permanent walls. They can be gateways to unexpected alliance and love. Their bond, once forged under duress, now serves as a symbol of hope, reminding us that growth often emerges from the most challenging circumstances. I personally find this story uplifting, proof that empathy and mutual respect can unite people from vastly different backgrounds. What's your take on their journey? Did any scene resonate with you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your opinions, questions, and ideas for where the story might go next.